Hey everyone, William here. Happy 2019. At the start of 2018, I had said that I was going to ship Manifold Garden that year. As evidenced by this video, I unfortunately did not succeed. However, we did get really close. In this video, I'm going to showcase various past versions of the game and discuss what has changed over time as well as what has been done so far. And then at the end, I'm going to go over what's still left to do, lay out a roadmap for 2019, and how we're going to finish the game and ship it. I started Manifold Garden in November of 2012. I wrote the first version over the course of 4 days during Thanksgiving weekend. At the time, I had zero game development experience. My original plan was actually to make an MMO set in Chicago with time-traveling elements. It was basically multiplayer Watch Dogs meets Skyrim meets 12 Monkeys. But even back then, it seemed a bit difficult, so I thought I would first make a small game as a practice project in order to become familiar with Unity. And my estimate was that it would take me about 3 months, 1 week to come up with the main mechanic, and then a week each to make a level for a total of 10 levels, and then finally 1 week to add UI, music, sound effects, and save system. The original title for the game was Relativity. It was inspired by the M.C. Escher print of the same name, and my idea was to make a game based off of that print. These were some of the first 3D environments I made in Unity. In this version of the game, it was actually the environment that rotated and not the player. You did that by flicking the mouse in a certain direction. There were about 3 levels, and in each one you just had to make contact with a red sphere, which then opened the exit door, and walking through that brought you to the next level. Here's a version of the game from about a month later. The main feature I added was a UI element to show which way you flick the mouse. I remember spending way too much time trying to pick out the right textures for the walls. After about 4 months of work, I decided to start over from scratch. This time it was the player that rotated. I wanted to focus on the player changing their perspective of the problem as opposed to changing the problem itself. I also chose not to focus on the art this time, instead only adding what was necessary. By September of 2013, we can start to see the basic elements that would become a key part of the game. The color of the floor changing, the flat switches, the cubes having an active versus inactive state. The game still had a very simplistic overall structure though, just one puzzle after another in a linear fashion. During this time, I also started to experiment with different effects for gravity changing. This one was inspired by the dimension changing effect from Quantum Conundrum. Here's a really early trailer for the game that I made back then. I don't think I ever actually released this one. Twenty 2014 was a pretty important year. A lot of the features that are now fundamental to Manifold Garden's identity were implemented during this time. Portals, edge detection, outdoor spaces, wool wrapping. This was an early iteration of the opening area. I had based it on a real-life building, but a lot of players actually found it really confusing in the game. They'd walk up the same set of stairs that they had come down from. Here is one of the early experiments with portals. The earliest version of the portals were created using render textures, which had a bunch of problems. Notice when you walk through the portal, there's a flash. That's the camera moving behind the mesh with the render texture, but right before the player gets teleported. The current version of portals in Manifold Garden uses stencil buffers. For a while, we also had ambient occlusion. This was back when we were still using baked light maps. During this period, I also started to experiment with more interesting pacing structures, having spaces where players could explore in between puzzles instead of just one room after another. This is when edge detection was first added. I think it was a slightly modified version of the basic edge detection shader that came with Unity. I had reverse engineered it to learn about depth buffers. At the time, I still wasn't fully convinced that this was the right direction for the art style. You can see that we hadn't quite leaned into the look yet. There were still the same colors, the same textures, the ambient occlusion from the previous art style. I basically just slapped a post-processing effect on top. There were a lot of issues with edge detection, such as flickering along polygon edges. You can also see that the lines are not anti-aliased either. Around April and May of 2014, I started to focus more on outdoor areas, and this eventually led to implementing wool wrapping. This was the very first version of the effect, and you can see here the edges fade out to white. This was to provide a sense of depth, but they do stand out against the background as the background is more of a beige color. This effect was done by placing copies of the geometry around the main world and teleporting the player to the other side when they travel too far. If you look at the background while the player falls, you can see the white edges pop in. That's the moment the player is teleported. Initially, I made the distance between the instances quite large because I had to manually place them and only did one layer out. I wanted them to be far enough that they filled in the background. In August of 2014, the game started to become quite similar to what it is today in terms of pacing and structure. An interesting problem we had at the time was that the edges would show up on top of the window texture. This is pretty obvious when you look out the window at one of the duplicate instances. The white lines are drawn on top of the window. We've since solved this problem, but transparency and edge detection really do not play well together. There was also no music in this version of the game, and all the sounds were just royalty-free sounds that I had found online. Regarding game feel, notice that when the player changes gravity, they get realigned to the axis instead of the direction they were facing at the start of the change. It took a while for me to realize this was an issue, but it contributed a lot to the gravity change not feeling smooth in this version. By May of 2015, I had started to lean into the art style a lot more. The grid on the walls were removed. I realized that they weren't necessary if the puzzles didn't need to be so precise. I added a vignette. I was also using more pastel color palette. It was also around this time that I started to bring other people onto the team. We started to experiment with sound design. I really liked having different sounds for each gravity. It was still really early at this point. For example, there's no variation in the time between footsteps, which sounds very unnatural. The edge detection by this point had also been cleaned up quite a bit. I managed to solve the issue of the flickering, but you can still see that the edges are drawn on top of the windows. That was still a problem. By 2016, we're seeing the broad strokes of the current art style of Manifold Garden. The biggest thing I added was the screen space gradient. Other than that, it was just hundreds of small tweaks across the board. Anti-aliasing for the edges, slightly darker ambient lighting, general improvements to art assets, stuff like that. At this point, we were still having problems with portals. I mentioned earlier that there were issues with render textures. Here you can see the problems we had with getting the lighting and the post-processing effects to be consistent across the portals. Shortly after this, Arthur Brucey, who had previously worked on Ori and the Blind Forest, joined the team as a graphics programmer and rewrote the portal system to use stencil buffers. This was a pretty big change, and he actually ended up writing a custom rendering system for the game. This is the portal system that was implemented in 2017 using stencil buffers. You can see right away that it is much smoother, and also more importantly, the edge detection effect is even across it. In 2018, we didn't really introduce any major new elements, at least visually. Instead, it was just a ton of polish on what was already there. During this time, Arthur made some pretty significant improvements to the edge detection shader as well as the anti-aliasing. I went back and also improved a lot of the geometry and architecture in various levels. Here are some images comparing the same areas in the game about 1 year apart. You can see that all the basic elements are there. The edge detection, the floor being colored, and the overall layout of the level, that's all the same. However, the 2018 image is much more striking. Obviously, the geometry's been improved and the colors have been refined, but also you can look at the quality of the lines. You'll see that the edge detection in 2017, it really struggles with a lot of the details, especially in the distance. You get a lot of these broken up lines. The 2018 lines, on the other hand, are all perfect. And this makes the art style overall feel much more elegant. Because it's such a minimalist look, the edges themselves have a lot of personality and they contribute a lot to the overall look. Another thing is, if you look at how the lines fade out in the distance, there's a very abrupt cutoff in 2017, whereas in 2018 you get a much smoother fade. All of these small details combine to make a big impact on the overall style. This brings us to 2019. I had mentioned in update video number 12 that the game is playable from start to finish. You can start the game, play through to the end, and get to the credits scene. All of the mechanics are highlighted and explored. You're probably wondering why isn't the game shipped and what's still left to do. In terms of design, our biggest focus right now is the pacing. I think the pacing for about 70% of the game is solid. Pacing is, of course, really important for the player experience, but I think the fact that this is our main concern right now is a good thing because it means that players are actually experiencing the game's content instead of getting hung up on bugs. The overall structure of the game used to be very convoluted and overwhelming. It has since been heavily streamlined. We've reduced the complexity and it's a much more focused experience. There are still stretches in the middle of the game which feel a little slow without enough big moments to signify player progress. Another challenge right now is making some of the narrative elements more prominent. currently these can be pretty easy to miss, and so players aren't getting the right context. I would say that the ending is probably the weakest part of the game at the moment. There are a few spaces there that are still really placeholder-ish, and overall it's not really delivering the impact that we want. As for tech, we're not adding any new features at this point. About 95% of what we do is bug fixing. A lot of it is new bugs caused by changes. We'd make a more optimized version of a system, but then it introduces like a few bugs which prevent the player from moving forward. For the most part, though, these are resolved in a day or two. The console version is coming along really well. I think we're about 70% of the way through the tasks. As for sound design and music, they are pretty much in the polish stage now. We've created a lot of custom systems for audio occlusion to work across portals and with row wrapping. What remains is just refining what we have, completing musical arcs, mixing the sounds, and making sure transitions are smooth. So that's where we're at. Our daily routine consists of pushing out a new build to the playtesters, getting a list of bugs in return, fixing those, and then repeat it all over again the next day. It's pretty tedious, but we're making steady progress. If you want to follow more closely, I've posted a roadmap of development. We also have a public Trello board where you can see what types of bugs we're currently tackling. If you want to stay up to date, we have a mailing list you can sign up. You can also subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter, we have a Discord. I also stream development daily. And don't forget, you can wishlist the game on Steam. All the links can be found in the video description below. That's it for this time. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Thank you all for the support, and I will see you around.